Hello and welcome everyone to another Climate Emergency Centre webinar. We've got a very important and interesting subject tonight on a very auspicious day, today being September the 11th, 23rd year anniversary, I think, of 9/11. And some of us on that day many years ago, 23 years ago, were at the dicey arms trade demo, and then we heard that a lot of wars going to be spreading and a lot more arms being sold. So we thought rather important to raise awareness about the arms trade and what's going on, and the need to shift over from arms to renewables is one of the themes that we've been talking about over the years. But Katie has very graciously agreed to come along and talk about what she's and her group are doing with Campaign Against the Arms Trade, which is a long-running, really amazing campaign raising awareness of the arms trade. So, Katie, thank you very much for coming. Over to you. Tell us about the great work you guys are doing. Over.
Great. Thanks very much, Phoenix, and great to meet you all. Thanks for giving some of your evening to be here. It was really nice to see, be in your cars, in your homes, outside, and all over the place. Just there when we all did the intros. I will just, should I share my slides now? Yes, I will. And that is at the bottom. Share. Presentation. Here we go. I think I want this presentation to actually play.
Yep, we can see that. I'll make it big.
Wonder if I can where is slideshow? This is what I want to do.
Brilliant.
There we go. So just to begin, yeah, my name is Katie. I'm the advocacy manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade. We're also often known as CAT, C-A-A-T. Sometimes people merge my name and CAT together, Katie from CAT or whatever. So no need to, I don't know if that helps to remember it or it makes it get more mixed up. I think probably more mixed up is usually the effect. So I do mostly, just to let you know what I do, kind of parliamentary policy work and legal work as well. So Kat has done 2 cases against the government, and then we've also supported our partners on a more recent one, trying to prevent arms going to Israel. So that's just kind of a bit about me. And by the way, I have loads of slides, but I don't actually plan to use them all. So some of them I might just flick through, or no need to feel like you have to read everything, but I can send them to you afterwards, Phoenix, if anyone has any questions. Yeah, so CAT is actually in its 50th anniversary this year. It was founded in 1974. And I have to say, the longer I'm working, the more I think that it's really impressive for anything to last 50 years, especially an organization, to keep the mission clear, to weather all of the ups and downs that come with any organization or campaign group. So I think what that says is that there's always a need to pay attention to what the UK is exporting in terms of weapons, because it's inherently problematic and inevitably they end up being used in some of the most serious crimes, including, in a legal sense, like crimes against humanity, potentially genocide, and so on, but also just from a peace perspective in kind of exacerbating conflict beyond what would have happened if those weapons might have been halted. So that's kind of where, as the name says, we're against the arms trade in all its forms, but we're a pretty small organization, so we focus on UK exports particularly. So in that sense, we're a bit of a UK watchdog, I would say. And then, yeah, we look at where UK arms exacerbate conflict, support an oppressive regime. Those would be kind of our 2 main ones. I would say that we're focusing on at the moment, and these are other goals where we have time and capacity. You might be interested to know we have a flat structure, so kind of, yeah, we're all paid the same. There aren't any managers. Yeah, non-hierarchy. I'd say probably I'm just speaking to people who have a bit of an idea about different flat structures, maybe have worked in those before. So if you have any questions on those, let me know. Yeah, and just there actually, that this is from 2021, but for CAT's work on Yemen, on trying to stop UK arms being used in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition. We were nominated by the Quakers for Nobel Peace Prize. So that was like a really special moment in our recent history. If you want to go on our website, these are some of the main resources that we have. So one thing that we'd be really well known for is a database of UK export licenses. So the information that the government produces on UK arms licenses is very difficult to kind of disaggregate or kind of pick out what actually does this all mean. So for I think nearly 20 years now, CAT has had a database where we take all of the data that the government publishes and makes it into kind of an easy, well, it's still a few bits and pieces to it, but it's a much more user-friendly way to see what we're actually exporting. And I've actually heard our researcher Sam has said that even government employees sometimes use the CAT database to look up information about arms because it's much easier to find it on our database than it is the government's.
Wow.
So that's just kind of one of the key issues really with arms exports, I would say, is just hiding the true extent of the data and then making it so that it's hard to be able to make a really clear statement about certain things. That's always like an obstacle that we're coming up against. And yeah, and just for anyone that's not familiar, everything that the UK exports that is military equipment needs to be licensed. So even though the companies themselves that make the equipment are technically private companies, even though, you know, really they're kind of almost merged with the state because of the degree of government support, but technically they are still private, but the government has to license all of the equipment. And as part of that, they have to say, is there a risk this will be used in war crimes or violations of international law? That's like one thing. And it has to get the stamp of approval from the Foreign Office and Department of Business and Trade. So just as well, I think that's a really important thing to know, that everything that we export, it's like stamped by the government to say we should be exporting this, and it follows all the rules that we have. That definitely isn't always the case, but I think it's not just that the companies are sending this stuff out and the government doesn't know, you know, what's in there. And we saw recently with UK exports to Israel, the government was asked, what does the UK send? Loads of MPs asked this question, what does the UK send to Israel? At once this recent cycle of bombardment started in Gaza last October, and the government's reply, so this would have been the former Tory government, but they just said, we don't send anything, meaning these are the private companies. But of course, they're licensing everything. So it's just this kind of games that we're always getting from the government on licenses, trying to use wordplay to hide what's actually happening. Yeah, and we've got fact files, and then two other databases on UK military exports, and also political influencing. And we have a new report on political influence coming out in 2 weeks. So that's kind of about how the arms industry and the government are really, in actuality, quite merged, and people like move between those two industries in terms of their jobs all the time. So it's very common to see someone who was high up in the Department of Defense move to maybe a board of management position in an arms company, and back and forth the other way. So just as a kind of a bit of background. Gonna skip through. This is from 2020. I actually need to find some updated information on for 2023, probably would be the most recent. But just to note, I'm always pointing this out because I think it's really important. It's not always exactly these top 5 countries, but if you look at the top 5 countries for 2020, for instance, US, China, UK, Russia, France, these are the share of arms sales in 2020. These are actually also the 5 Security Council members at the UN, the ones that can veto Security Council decisions about like, they kind of would make the biggest political decisions, I would say, on any global international stage. So that's often, you know, when to intervene militarily in a conflict. It would be things like whether or not to recognize a certain state, all these kind of things. I think even like the call for a ceasefire, they tried to get that through the Security Council, but I think it was vetoed as well. So just, I think what I'm trying to say really is that the most powerful countries in the world, in terms of political power, also export arms. We live in like a very militarized world, even at, you know, the highest levels of the UN. And I think if you didn't know that, I didn't know that until I started working at CAT. but it just made me see how intertwined politics and militarism is. So this might have slightly changed for 2023, or it might not be these exact top 5, but they're all within the top 8, those 5 Security Council members. And the US always by far, like you can see there, 54% compared to like 13% in China. US is always like more than double the next country in terms of weapons exports. Yeah. Okay, we'll go through this. This is just like, why do countries buy arms? It can be different reasons. I think like the main point I would make about this kind of thing, like why do countries buy arms? Like certain countries might buy them for a particular conflict that they're actually involved in, but it's also, you don't just buy arms just for the military component. It's almost like a way of creating a relation with another country. So last year, the country that, so this actually would have been the data for 2022, we would have been able to finish that data in 2023. So it's like the last full year that we have data available for, and like we'll publish 2023 this year because they just have such a lag in giving out the information. But anyway, it was Qatar, and Qatar is actually not at war with anybody, and was also buying a lot of different arms imports, and from its perspective, from other countries like France and the US. And I guess what this is like a way of creating a relation with another country where, if their defense industry is becoming reliant on you buying them, you have more political power over them. So that also we would have seen with Saudi Arabia, which is always one of the biggest customers for UK exports. But it kind of means then that Saudi Arabia have a very big sway over the UK defense industry. Like at points before the Yemen war, so I think it was like probably it was the kind of years the worst, let me think, 20 like 14, 15, 16, those kind of years. There was a 5-year block, and I think it was 49% on average over 5 years of UK arms exports were going to Saudi Arabia. So it means the whole defense industry is very, very reliant on Saudi Arabia. And it also means that Saudi Arabia can basically say to the UK government, if we stop, if we like this kind of, it actually gives Saudi more power over the UK than the UK has over Saudi. So we're always told by our government, if we sell these arms, we'll be able to tell these other countries to, look after human rights, etc., etc. But actually what happens is often these weapons are used in ways that violate international law. And even if they don't violate international law, it's still used horrifically. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, do you want to come in?
No, I was just reading there that, the breaking international laws in several places, particularly what was going on in Yemen was,
yeah, really like horrible, like atrocities really is the only word for it. I think one that stuck with me that we had in our court case was, say, for instance, where a market was bombed in a town, like a really busy market for, I don't know, maybe like 1 or 2 military targets, but dozens of people died. And then when kind of rescuers came in, there was another bomb immediately afterwards. And the government said, throughout our court case, they said there's no risk of violations of international humanitarian law. But kind of in terms of proportionality, how could it be proportional? Which is something they're supposed to abide by to, double bomb a marketplace. And once then people are going to come in to try and rescue people and get them out, and then to do the same bomb again. So basically, but our government didn't want to admit that that was a reason to stop exporting to them. So it just shows like it's so political. It is never ever just about the weapons. It's quite complicated, but I think the more you kind of start to look into it, it's very helpful for understanding kind of political processes and going on, and what's motivating people or countries. So yeah, let me just check how I'm doing for time. Oh my God, already. So I'm just going to skip a few of these slides.
You're fine. We didn't start till 10 past, 11 past, so you can keep flowing for longer. It's okay.
Because there's more that was just kind of the intro stuff. I don't want to spend all my time on that. So this is 2022 is the last year that we have data for the whole year, and we'll shortly have our data for 2023. Like I said, there's just a lag. So we, for other things, you might have the data right at the beginning of the year, but we tend to have it at the end for the previous year. But here you can see, it's Qatar, like I was saying. This was the year of the World Cup in Qatar as well.
Katie, sorry, can you define what a seal is? SIEL.
Oh, yes, sorry, I should have actually started with that. So, remember I was saying about the government's licensing system and how it's very like it lacks transparency. It's quite confusing. One of the other ways that it's confusing is there are different types of licenses. So a seal is a single issue export license. I think I would just kind of divide them broadly into single licenses and open licenses. And the single license would be generally specify like a specific item, and it would also give you a value for the cost of the item. So you can, when you look at the license, you can say, okay, it's for this equipment, and this is how much this equipment costs. And so basically, you can kind of come up with, say, a value for all of the single licenses that went to Qatar. However, there's also these open licenses where you don't get to know, say on an open export general license, which would be like a common one, the most kind of secretive of them all, it will list potentially more than one destination. It might list, 5 or 6 different destinations, different countries, and then it will have a long list of different types of equipment, and you will never know what, if any, of this has been exported. And there's no requirement to ever say how much of it has been transferred, and there's no value attached, so you don't know how much for each item. So it actually manages to hide a lot of the UK's arms exports. So like a good comparison for that would be kind of through the Yemen war, when we just looked at single licenses, which gave the exact value of arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. I think it was somewhere, and don't quote me on this because I would need to double check it again, but it was something like over the course of the war, maybe like 7 or 8 million, something like that, worth of UK exports. But our researchers looked at the companies that were exporting and looked at their end of year like revenues and all of their financial data, and estimated that it had to be at least 20 billion. So sorry, billion for both of those. Around 7 or 8 billion when you just looked at single licenses. But when you included all of the open licenses, it had to be near 20 billion. So it was like more than double. But the government doesn't actually publish any of those financial figures on the open licenses. That was just estimates based on those companies, and they knew specifically what to look for. But we can't do this with every country. So yeah, it just makes it's hard. Like, for instance, just for us to say like a real top line fit, like, thing you think, oh, we could easily say, like, what's the value of the UK's arms exports? And we can't say that for certain because we don't know the value of the open licenses. And often loads of things, like often the open licenses are used really extensively. Like for Saudi, it was more than half through that war. At the moment, for arms that are going to Israel, the F-35 jets are all on open licenses. So we have to come up with estimates for how much we think that might be worth based on other publications, but the government doesn't publish any of it. So yeah, that's just it's a huge problem. And like, say when CAT won a legal case to stop arms exports to Saudi, this was back in 2019. The court agreed with us and said there shouldn't be any new licenses to Saudi Arabia, but all of the open licenses will stay open. Like just this kind of thing. Well, why should the open licenses have stayed open? Because they didn't have to report anything that was going through them, but no new licenses. Just this kind of thing where you think, well, that doesn't make that much sense, and most of the time it doesn't. So yeah, those top 5: Qatar, Saudi Arabia, USA, Turkey, and Ukraine. And even though there's and it's true that the UK exports a lot to countries in the Middle East, but also to countries in the EU and in Europe, and always to the US. Would be a big partner. So it's not just the Middle East. Like here we've got Ukraine, France, Italy, Canada, and the US. So just important to bear that in mind as well. Let me see. Oh yeah, that's for the 5-year average. Yeah, still those countries at the top. I'm just gonna fly through these because there's some other stuff I wanted to get on. But as you can see, yeah, these are still all those single licenses. So we have to kind of just make that distinction all the time when we're talking about it. So thanks for asking, Phoenix. I nearly forgot.
That's so much to Saudi Arabia. That's 40%. It's ginormous.
Yeah. So this is kind of the figure. This is from SIPRI, source SIPRI. They're this Stockholm Institute for Peace and what is the ORIFER? peace and I can't remember what the or is. But yeah, if you want any statistics on global arms exports as opposed to just the UK, that's the place to go. And this was UK arms exports from 2015 to 2019. And for Saudi Arabia, it's 40%, so it's a huge percentage. Oman, USA, India, China, and then other 25%, which other 25% is still pretty significant. But yeah, this includes some of the beginning years of the war. But in a different 5-year bracket that I've seen before, I think it would have been probably 2012 to 2017, it was nearly 50% Saudi Arabia. But that's gone down over the last couple of years since they have stopped as like the active bombardment of Yemen. Now the UK and the US are doing that instead. So so yeah, these are just some of the, I think you probably would already be aware of some of these, but like when you keep flooding a particular conflict with arms, it makes the conflict last longer. And then when you excuse or ignore crimes that are happening with weapons that you've exported, which is what's happened with the previous government for sure, it kind of creates this climate of impunity where countries know, well, the UK wants to keep, it's not just the UK, it's the same with the US. They want to export, they want to have, you know, big internal defense industries. And so we can do whatever we want because we're not going to be held to account. And I think kind of seeing another example of this recently with, you know, the US really flooding Israel and Gaza with weapons in a way which makes the chances of getting to a ceasefire really reduce. Yeah, that's one of the main things that we'd be trying to push on. So I have a good bit of information about Saudi Arabia. Let me just see how much time I have left. I'm just going to quickly touch on this, and then I want to maybe talk about the recent suspension of some licenses to Israel, because while there's some issues with that, it is actually also at the same time, I mean, there's some serious issues or like kind of gaps in the suspension, but it's also a big victory. So I just kind of wanted to end on that because that's been a year of campaigning of like loads of different organizations, not just CAT, and another legal case that our partners are doing. And it's just good to see actually loads of public pressure and campaigning works, because this information is so depressing and horrific. But also, you know, we actually do get results when we're going up against like very big, powerful institutions and people. So I think that's important to bear in mind, that like the campaigning does work, even if it's a really difficult thing to campaign against. So yeah, that was that 20 billion figure I mentioned. Oh yeah, and I can actually see it here where it says 6.8 billion for the single licenses, but actually it was 20 billion when you include all of the licenses together. Yeah, this was about,
just to throw in there, Kate, you know, it's gone beyond, you know, just that 20 billion in arms. You had RAF officers,
yeah, it's true.
Saudi, you know, Saudi Air Force planning places, advising and supporting the bombing of hospitals and places in Yemen, which our tax money should not be paying for, you know, for that to be.
Yeah, and seconded also from BAE Systems to operate these very, you know, complicated weapon systems. And that was something at the time as well, you know, when we were campaigning on that specifically, we were told, oh, well, it wouldn't make a difference if we stopped selling because somebody else would just sell. But actually, the reality is these are, you know, like very high levels of technology that all fit together. You know, if the UK government had said, no, we are not going to stop, the Saudi coalition would not have been able to rearm, you know, in 1 or 2 weeks. It would have taken months. Like it would have really slowed down the progress. And so that's just another, yeah, and I think it really connects to having people on the ground supporting a particular bombardment.
Just to throw one in, because that does seem to be a common thing that's thrown out. If we didn't sell them the arms, another country would. Do you guys have a comeback on that one? You know, well, if we didn't sell it, then China, Russia, Germany, or somewhere else would sell.
Yeah, I think like the first thing we would say is like when weapons are being used in violation of international law, in, you know, crimes against humanity and in genocide, you can't just say, oh, someone else would commit genocide anyway, so that means it's fine for us to do it. You wouldn't use that logic anywhere else in any kind of moral situation, that it's fine for you to commit a crime if potentially, which you don't even know to be the case, someone else might do the same thing. I think the other thing is we've seen across all the conflicts that I've campaigned on, everything generally I mean, there's two really big axes, and it would be kind of the US, UK side of things, which also kind of follows, say, the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and then also Israel. And then you kind of have the Russia axis, which would probably include, like, then if you go through the Middle East, Iran, Yemen, Houthis, and then kind of like, and this is a very, very oversimplification. It's not to say that all of these countries are aligned, or there's plenty of conflicts that exist outside of this, but also it's not realistic to think that all of these political situations would mean that, like, you know, for example, with the US aren't going to let, for instance, Israel start buying off Russia, or, you know, China isn't going to start buying off the US. Like, they follow quite specific in a way. It's only with allies that countries tend to buy off each other. So, and especially for the biggest conflicts with the most weapons, it tends to be either the US or Russia who are kind of calling the shots. Like, you know, Russia arming Assad, for instance, in Syria, this kind of thing. So it's just not realistic to say that, you know, there's going to be all these swaps when actually it follows quite clear patterns,
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah, and it also, you know, there is actually political leverage if you use it. Like, one of the things that we were told kind of behind the scenes that is quite likely is that, like, the more attention that was put on Yemen, including the legal cases, political pressure, campaigning, local campaigning, people reaching out to their MPs, the more likely it is that the UK government will say, you know, we're getting a lot of heat for this internally, like, you need to be more cautious about your behavior. Like, and if all, and that was kind of just from the UK side, but there's lots of campaigning that happened all over the world. If that hadn't happened, the death toll would have been even higher. So I think that, you know, that's such a, it's a low bar just to think, okay, we want to try and lower the death toll. But it's true, you know, like, without any of this campaigning, things would be so much worse. So, like, we really need to put pressure on our governments when they are selling, to try and reduce the harm that's already being done. I'm just going to skip through this. I just wanted to show two articles, and then I'll talk quickly about Gaza, and then I'll finish up. This was from, and I'm pretty sure this article was from 2021. So it's before everything that happened in, before, like, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also before this latest round of genocide and occupation in Gaza. This was from the Financial Times, and yeah, ESG, I think it's economic social governance. It's kind of like this, yeah, you know, for investing and for companies to be like, socially responsible. And let me just see if I'm on the right. Yeah, what was happening was that investors didn't want to invest in arms companies. And I think it's important to point out that this was actually already happening before this kind of recent, because I think things have become, there's, like, so much more conflict in the world, even over the last couple of years, like the last 4 or 5. And then BAE's chair, Roger Carr, let me just hide myself here so I can read this. We are not there to help ourselves, but also help the industry and make sure this sector is not on the naughty step in terms of investment. And it's understood for the value it creates and the ethics and principles that it adopts in the way that it delivers its product. So, like, this is completely abhorrent, especially because we know that BAE was the main supplier of the Saudi coalition in Yemen, and we know that there was loads of war crimes committed. Like, I won't go into all of them, but just, like, you know, attacking civilian objects, schools, buses, funerals, weddings, the marketplace that I mentioned. And then at the same time, he's saying, you know, we value, it creates value, and that, you know, adopts these particular ethics and principles, which we know isn't the case. But just a thing as well, like, it shows how effective campaigning that connects militarism and investment can be. I just wanted to point that out for anyone who's an activist, like, looking into, you know, pension funds, where does your council invest? Actually, like, if it was bothered them enough to put a quote, like, you know, do an article and make a quote about it, it's obviously working. That's always my metric. You know, if we see an angry quote from someone in an arms company or in you know, in a high level ministerial position, or campaigning is working. Yeah, and this is from, like, a recent, the sector as a whole has been blacklisted by many European investors. Yeah, it makes no sense. It makes lots of sense. And then this is another, this is one of think it like a really, I can't believe these were on the same day. So I'm just going to show you two articles from December 2021. So this was when they had stopped the bombardment for a bit and started it back again. And then Saudi Arabia, it lobbied, and I guess here it says bullied and bribed states at the Human Rights Council to end an inquiry into Yemen. And that was actually an inquiry that was looking at violations on all sides of the conflict. So it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, it was also looking at crimes committed by the Houthis, you know, across the entire country, because yeah, there was a lot of different like factors and groups involved. And I think it was like oops, sorry. Here's a quote. Let me just move this down. Oh yeah, Agnes Callamard, who's the Secretary General of Amnesty, said to the Times at the time, weapons from the US, UK, France are part and parcel of these war crimes, possibly crimes against humanity that are being committed in Yemen. Then on the same day, so you can see there, Monday, December 6th, it was the same as this one, Monday, December 6th. Roger Carr, who is chairman of BAE, unless that's changed, but I think it's still him, had this article in the op-ed saying that business has a key role to play leveling up Britain. So when you read that title initially, you wouldn't kind of think, okay, what's the connection with Yemen? But he's the chairman of this company that is sending, you know, that is the primary sender of arms to that conflict from the UK. And I think that's just a really important thing to be aware of. Here he's kind of talking about the leveling up agenda, the British economy, jobs, you know, 25% of working age people did not have 5 good GCSEs. So he's kind of talking about like social inequality, and that BAE can be the company that that rectifies all this, which really should be the government tackling inequality, not an arms company. But it's also no coincidence, I'm going to stop sharing, no coincidence that he would have had that op-ed in the paper on the same day as they were getting, you know, bad press through the other piece, which was like, yeah, in the foreign affairs section. So it's just something that arms companies are always doing, kind of saying, you know, we're leaders in research and innovation. We will be doing like tech hubs with schools and so on, rather than actually exposing them for the crimes that they know that they're committing and never do anything about. You never see an arms company say, actually, from what we've seen from the UN reports, we shouldn't be sending arms to this conflict. And it's just a way for them to whitewash their image. So I think I'm nearly done. I'll just do like 2 minutes quickly on that suspension. So if anyone's seen this, it was last Monday. The new government announced that they have suspended 30 licenses for arms exports to Israel for use in Gaza. So while one thing that they've done, which is really problematic, is they left out the F-35 jet program. So that's a program that's builds the F-35 jet, but the UK makes 15% of that particular jet. And other countries are also involved. I think it's like the Netherlands, Norway, Turkey, and then everything is sent to the US where it's made there. But we still make 15%. It's actually quite a lot of the jet. And like some of those components would be the bomb release mechanism is made in Brighton. You might have heard some of this before. The rear fuselage is also made in the UK, and that's like the back bit of the plane. So it's, you know, if you take away 15% of a jet, like it won't fly. In that sense, it's very significant. And they've purposely left that out, saying that it's too, basically saying the logistics of the components is too complicated to stop sending. But the kind of the really good and significant thing about all of this is the reason that they've had to stop sending, they've had to suspend some licenses, is because the UK's licensing criteria says the government will not grant a license if there's a clear risk it's in violation of international humanitarian law, or that there might be a violation. So that just means that if there's a clear risk that there may be violations, it's supposed to stop the weapons. And also, like, the UK is a country, and everyone who lives here, from being complicit before crimes happen. It's not a kind of once loads of war crimes have happened, then we'll stop exporting. The government has this obligation to assess. In the previous government, I would say, like, really they were lying, where they repeatedly said, there's no clear risk, there's no risk, we don't think there's a risk of these weapons being used. And there was actually leaks from, I don't know if you saw this, from Alicia Kearns, who was a Conservative MP. she's still in Parliament and was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And she said, no, like the legal advice that the government have been getting from the Foreign Office lawyers says that there is a risk. And yet Cameron stood up and continued, and like he made this speech in Washington. It's obviously a very US focused speech rather than caring about the domestic audience, and said, no, there's no risk. We will continue to export. So this has been going on all year, this kind of like fight for the truth, really. And the fact that the Foreign Office lawyers admitted, yes, like internally, and we saw, I don't know if you saw this a couple of weeks ago, I think it was just 3 weeks ago, maybe, a diplomat resigned over this, who had been previously involved in licensing to the Middle East of UK arms. And he said it couldn't possibly be the case that we can still have all these licenses open. So the government has now admitted that there is a risk of war crimes being committed. We would say that it's beyond just a risk, that, you know, that Israel has committed crimes against humanity. I'm nearly done now, so I'll see this question. But that means that we have like a very good ground now to say, actually, like nothing should be sent there, and especially not parts for an F-35 jet, even if it's going via other countries, because you've admitted that what we were saying for this last year is correct. And there should be, I mean, a lot of accountability, especially for David Cameron, who was the one who had the most sway in terms of those licensing. So while things are obviously very grim globally, I really don't think that we would have had even those 30 licenses suspended if it wasn't for all of the marches, if it wasn't for, like, any MP that I've met this year says this has been the thing that they've gotten the most emails about ever in their careers, like more than constituency issues. They've never had as much contact about this. If it wasn't for kind of like parliamentary work and loads of different organizations getting involved in this, we wouldn't even have this suspension. And we're up against very big like powers, in the sense that like the US did not want that to happen. And we could see that from the reaction of the US after the suspension was announced, and also from the Prime Minister of Israel, who called it shameful. But it's a step towards accountability, because it shows if you continue to commit these crimes, there will be consequences. And we're like, as a nation, are not just going to stand by and let it happen. So that makes me really hopeful for like the power of people, I think. As I'm sure you all know, like when you like look at what's happening in Gaza, like the US is really backing it. So all of these actions, like every time someone goes out in a march, they're really kind of challenging like the US military hegemony over the world, I think. And we're actually getting results with this suspension. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, Katie. Very comprehensive. Absolutely.
I hope it wasn't too much. And I see the question. Let me have a look. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Really inspiring. I mean, I know a fair bit from being an activist, but definitely learned a lot there as well. So, folks, if you've got a question or feedback or comment, doesn't necessarily have to be a question. You can make a comment or anything about what you've heard tonight. If you want to. There's a little reactions tab down the bottom. Let's put this back off spotlight so we can see you stick their hand up. Reactions tab down the bottom that you can stick out. Oh, Alex is first off the mark. There we go. Alex, West Country. Go for it, Alex. Your question, comment, or feedback. Over.
A comment on that. So I was just looking at Israel's funding and stuff. There's been something called the Strategic Military Edge. I'm sure some people may be aware of it, but it's been running for a long time, and it was like 4 billion every 2 years. And with the F-35 project, most of that funding was for that, and this has probably been running for, I don't know, 20 years. It's a long time since I researched it, and I think a lot of the money's the funding for Israel was historically for the F-35 projects, the F-35Is for I for Israel. And I think that's what's built up the lobbying system in America that's made Joe Biden so stuck not to do anything. And just the other comment is, there's a lot of them at RAF Lakenheath as well. I do believe that they were flying weapons out of Lakenheath Milton for Yemen stuff as well. But just a couple of comments on the F-35s. I think they're like 760 8 billion, a million each. So there's a lot of contract money that flows into these F-35s over the years, which creates a basic force to give them whatever they want because they're on these programs. And the main reason for this was because of the fear. Don't quote me on this, but probably the fear of Iran creating nuclear weapons. And Donald Trump tore up the JPCO to stop them making nuclear weapons, so they paid less for oil. And is this chance of nuclear breakout. But what I'm saying is Israel got so much funding, probably because Iran were going to make nuclear weapons and NATO and the US were scared. And that's just my comments.
Very good. Cool. What was the name of the first thing you mentioned? The strategic something. And if you've got a web link, if you could pop it in.
So if someone just typed, I'm not very good at spelling, someone just types it. It's called the Strategic Military Edge Agreement. That's between the US and Israel. And that's what they get a lot of funding for, like billions for years. But now it's probably on like 8 or 10 bill every 2 years with this war. But it was all designed for fear of nukes, I believe, partially. And also the all of the Houthi and the other groups, they wanted to make Israel strong, but because Israel already had nukes, they were like allowed the specialities to have good funding, and the Strategic Military Edge Agreement's been running for a while.
Okay, I found a link.
Yeah, last time I checked, it was renewed in the Obama administration, but that's something to look at. There's probably a lot of crazy stuff that's hard to understand in there. I've never read it.
Okay. All right. Good to be aware of some of these things. Paolo, next up. Thanks, Alex. Paolo.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just have a question about northern Syria, about Rojava. If you can give us any updates there, Katie, about exports to Turkey.
Sorry, do you know what? I actually don't have any figures on me to hand, but Turkey is always one of the top countries that the UK exports to. I think it was in some of the slides that I've shown. So if you like, I can check into this tomorrow and send some info to Phoenix, because that's actually one of the areas that we always campaign on.
Okay, I think I've got a couple of bits I'm bunging this up, but let's go with Jay, she, her, over.
Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Wicked. Thank you so much for that. It was really super informative. I was just wondering, obviously there's been some successes with in terms of not exporting to so many licenses to Israel. And wondering, like, obviously there's a lot going on there that's kind of shining a spotlight on that particular conflict at the moment. But are there any lessons that like you've taken from those wins, or like that we can take from those wins in terms of like making sure that we can get those sorts of wins in other campaigns, maybe where that isn't so much of a kind of like political spotlight at the moment, but we know that there's still ongoing conflicts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one takeaway that I've had from this campaign is that the more you need, it's kind of like how I would visualize it is that there's like a center, and you need to have as many things hitting the center at the same time as you possibly can. So when you have, if you can have like a media story plus some parliamentary questions plus some local action at the same time, and like create a bit of heat, that does work. And I think it's been really interesting on this, seeing, because on Yemen, the legal advice always said, so the Foreign Office lawyers and diplomats will do the legal advice and then hand it to the minister. And then the minister says, it matches, you know, there's no risk. That's what the legal advice says. So I can just say, continue arms exports. That was what we saw the whole time for Yemen. And even though we had loads of evidence of like overwhelming evidence of war crimes from like UN bodies, etc., they really stuck to that line. But in Gaza, it was impossible for them to stick to that line. And kind of and what we saw was like David Cameron be like, I've just been given legal advice from the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. He said this in Parliament. He was like, I'm not a lawyer. So, you know, these papers come across my desk. I don't know what they've said. It was really like atrocious for someone who's both the foreign secretary and a former prime minister to just pretend he didn't know what he himself, it turned out like 2 weeks later, that evidence came out and he himself has signed it all off. But then he kind of threw the Foreign Office lawyers under the bus a bit. And I think that really got their backs up, which was really helpful for the campaign because they were kind of being made complicit by, you know, he just fully said, look, this is what the advice says. And then when they actually changed the advice, they still stuck with the same line. And then we actually saw a resignation. So kind of really trying to make it, yeah, I guess that's what I mean about targeted, like not targeted against specific people, like it's not a witch hunt, but it's like, how does this institution, the Department of Foreign Affairs, stand by this when we know that it's not the case? And then kind of seeing how ministers, civil servants, the media all works together. I think that's like a really key thing with that campaign. They have to be getting it from all sides at the same time to see, like, to get the kind of the momentum is a really, really important part of any campaign, I would say. I hope that's helpful. I think it's applicable to nearly any issue. You know, if you can get like a good op-ed in somewhere, if you can get an MP to ask a question, you know, if you can have like your local area reach out to their, I mean, I do parliamentary work, so that's kind of like maybe why some of my answers are a bit skewed that way. But yeah, things happening at the same time.
Jay, do you want something back on that, or like a?
No, thank you. That's yeah, I think I think the building momentum thing is always a really important thing. And yeah, thank you. That's great.
Very good tactics there to build a media story, political pressure, and doing direct action. Firm believer that actually taking action raise awareness as well as all the other tactics. Hugo, go for it.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Katie. I just had, I suppose, just wondering about in the sort of the future you can envisage if, I suppose, laws around human rights, you know, continue not to be, I suppose, the key leverage with which change happens, whether increasingly the climate and environmental sort of laws and momentum and whether they could be made use of. I mean, I think in I suppose it's complicated because I think the IPCC currently it doesn't include, unless somebody corrects me, it doesn't include emissions associated with military activities, and so maybe that actually means there probably isn't such a strong legal route making use of climate arguments. But if that were to change, I don't know if there's any sense of that changing. Anyway, I just put that question out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's loads of different like things I would want to like pull out of it, because say anything that goes down a legal avenue, and like my position, I think Kat's position as an organization would be that like the law is one tool amongst many tools, and the law is just inherently political. It might as well just be politics in the courtroom. Like that's how I view it. And then sometimes when you play it to your advantage, it can be useful, but it also facilitates the political landscape that we have as much as, you know, it just literally like Parliament, it can go either way, and most of the time it goes one particular direction towards those who are in power. So I think kind of when you raise climate there, and especially when I look at it just from human rights kind of point of view, or like war crimes or violations of international humanitarian law, like none of those say anything about the death toll of a conflict. There's no law against a really, really high death toll. In any, like that's not what an IHL violation is or a war crime. There's proportionality, but then, you know, in legally, if you had a military, I mean, how do they, you know, for instance, justify Hiroshima? You know, that was nothing to do with the death toll. It was like, well, this will end this conflict, and then they justified a really horrific action. That is definitely how the law as it stands works. So it's never enough just to say like, and I think maybe while if I'm kind of advocating to a politician or to a government, I will definitely put international law as like my first kind of like base in my conversation with them. But I think for activists, we don't have to like limit ourselves to that. Like we can be concerned about, you know, like none of those laws say anything about peace in general or the environment or like the sustainability of our future. You know, they allow wars to happen. And I think when you see what happens to land after these types of conflicts, sometimes it can be unlivable. I think that like Gaza is a really terrible example of that, where it's not just about winning militarily, it's also about making the land impossible to live on in terms of like, you know, growing food, safe water, safe place to live. So I think there's actually a really like big and important gap for the civil society and for activism in general to like imagine something different, because we can't just stick with what we have or we're going to keep getting the same things that we have. So I feel like you've asked the exact right question and I haven't been able to like fully answer it, but I think like you're right.
Okay, that's just Barry beaming into that. I've got a couple of bits I just want to pop in there from we're coming towards the tail end. Hopefully you don't mind flowing on for another five minutes or so, or a little bit. Basically, as an activist of 35 odd years, and you know, we got involved with the dicey arms trade demo, like I said at the beginning, right at the beginning when 9/11 happened, and suddenly we realised that so many more wars are going to happen. You know, these wars of aggression are illegal. We found out when we occupied Parliament Square against illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan under international law. You're allowed to defend yourself, but not attack other countries. There is successful, you know, things of activism, like the Hawk Jet example. A number of women trained up, prepared for a year, went into a Hawk Jet factory that they knew was being used to bomb civilians and, you know, create genocide in East Timor. And they did an action, they smashed up the Hawk Jet, and it went to court, and they said, we've done a minor crime of criminal damage to stop the major crime of genocide. And it became case law that others, you know, could use, and it has gone back and forth a bit. But, you know, direct action gets results. 2 million people marched against the Iraq war. 8 people went out from Bristol in 2 cars with D-locks and found the bomb supply convoys that was going between RAF bases and D-locked onto the trucks front and back, and delayed it for enough hours that it missed the window of bombing. If more people went to the arms factories and took direct action, and you know, do whatever you can in whatever way, you know, raise awareness, social media, articles, make sandwiches, help with transport, whatever you can do, you know. And my last point really is to say that, you know, war is one of, you know, the biggest destroyers of the environment going. It absolutely devastates the environment on so many levels. And when they did the big, whatever it was, Kyoto and Paris agreements, they agreed to not include military pollution and CO2 emissions and destruction from war, because it was off the chart. It's one of the biggest, you know, destroyers and polluters of the environment. So, folks, we're coming towards the end. If anyone else wants a quick comment or question, jump in now with your hand. Otherwise, we'll go to Katie for sum up. Paolo, and if you want to put 3 words.
Thank you, Katie, coming along. Been really, really.
Brilliant. If anyone wants to put 3 words in the chat, as we do at the end of what they thought about tonight, and if you want to send us your email or whatever it is, pop them in. I'll hand over to Katie in a sec for final comments or final words. Check out Campaign Against the Arms Trade, support their great work, and any of the campaigns that are around at the moment to, you know, demilitarize. I think one of the things I want to mention was the Lucas plan, really finally, before I come to Katie, is, you know, arms to renewables. We cannot continue at the rates of destruction that we're going. If we continue on these wars, then, you know, the environment is already being devastated. Is even more devastated by wars. And we need to come up with plans like the Lucas plan, which was a group of arms factory workers many years ago came up, and there's a new Lucas plan to transition away from building armaments into building renewables. And we need a just transition for oil workers to transition to renewables, for arms workers to transition to, you know, more peaceful economy, sustainable economy. Let's get our jobs into repairing the environment and transitioning to a more sustainable and peaceful world. And we've got to work out how we can do that. That's one of our missions. And I'm saying that as a son of a Marine. I know a lot about military. I grew up studying it in a lot of ways, and I know potentials, and we really need to shift to the sustainable economy very quick because if everyone carries on the way we're going, it's going to get even messier. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming for another wonderful Wednesday webinar with thought stimulating conversations. It will be up on the YouTube fairly soon, tonight probably, or tomorrow. Have a look. I'll stick it in there. And then over to Katie. Thank you very much for agreeing to come, and particularly on this very auspicious date of September the 11th, coming and sharing the great work that you're doing at CAT. Keep it up. Over to you for the last words. Thank you very much for all your dedication and hard work. Keep at it. We love it.
Thanks, Phoenix. It was really nice to be with you all this evening. Like, just disheartening for me. I think I spent so much of my time doing emails. And yeah, I think the only thing I was going to finish on was, like, I think something genuinely hopeful, because I know we're just faced with so much horror, especially the last couple of years, like fresh, you know, again. But it's not just about like the specific atrocities or the specific, like, I guess I've spoken a lot about law, but like we need to push for just a completely different standard of norms. You know, there were certain things that used to happen and they don't happen anymore. And we have to have the war and like, I mean, there'll always be conflict, but resolving it in the way that we are, which you couldn't even call resolving, you know, like by destroying each other and destroying our planet, does not have to be inevitable. Like, the human world has changed so much in its lifetime. Like, that should be something that we really, like, I think that like this space, like for people who are activists and thinking like much bigger than just any particular day or year, like I hope that you find ways to like draw that into what you're doing, and I'll try to. Anyway, yeah, have a nice evening.
Brilliant. All right, whatever you're doing, have a fantastic evening. We will stop the recording there. See you on other weeks, and please network, share, like and subscribe, and share this webinar afterwards. It'll be on the WhatsApp and the Telegram chat, and save the chat.